developments of this country began when education was regarded as a substitute for culture. Or rather, when instruction was regarded as a substitute for education. Or rather, when getting facts by teaching was regarded as a substitute for getting truth by tradition. For the facts were few, were carefully selected, and were almost entirely trivial. Culture has to do with a complete view of things, of all things. But the modern mind, which we call the modern mind so as to distinguish it from the mind, cannot think about all things. It cannot think at all. Men do not know where their own thoughts came from.
When you have an answer for everything, it seems that most of the world does not want to talk to you anymore. It doesn't matter if you're a nice guy. It doesn't even matter if you're funny. It certainly doesn't matter if you're right. Most of the world does not want to talk to you anymore. When the prevailing philosophy is that truth is relative, or that it's basically unknowable or strictly personal, or that it's largely irrelevant, in other words, when the only certainty is our uncertainty, there's nothing more irritating than having someone come along and smash such non-conclusive conclusions. There's nothing more unsettling than someone who has settled things. The most unwelcome person on a college campus today is someone who can argue persuasively that there is a truth, that it is absolute, all-important, accessible, and universal, which explains why G.K. Chesterton is not taught or studied or even considered in our universities. Of course, it's also because he violates almost every maxim of political correctness. Go right down the list. He criticizes feminism, vegetarianism, modern art, starting from Impressionism, free verse, pornography, immorality, birth control, compulsory education, jazz, and the rest. He defies the gods, Darwin, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. He even criticizes James Joyce. But these are details. It's not what he attacks, but what he defends that leaves him persona non grata. He defends marriage. He defends having babies. He defends Western civilization. He defends the Crusades. He defends the Catholic Church. And if that isn't bad enough, he even defends smoking. And his balance attacks throw everyone off balance. He criticizes both socialism and capitalism, both big government and big business, both liberals and conservatives. He also criticizes paganism and Puritanism, optimists and pessimists, and so on. But in spite of seemingly having all the odds against him, Chesterton has the advantage over all his adversaries. He's not only bigger than they are, he's also more well-rounded. Now, you may think that I'm referring to the 300-pounder who called himself the politest man in all of England because he could stand up on a bus and offer his seat to 3 women at once. No, I'm talking about the fact that he created something even bigger than himself, an incredible and incalculable body of writing that covers everything, and that reveals that G.K. Chesterton is the rarest of all human birds, a complete thinker. His opponents suffer from the problem of not being merely small, but narrow. They may disagree with Chesterton on the point that affects them, or about the issue that concerns them most, but all they can do is offer that one point or that single issue. They've never given enough thought to anything else. Feminists can't get past their feminism. Socialists can't get past their socialism. Evolutionists can't get past their selves. Psychologists can't get past their pasts. They're all comically obsessed with the small things that define them. Chesterton cannot even be defined. He cannot be pigeonholed. Our categories are too small to hold him. One of the reasons that he's not taught in our university is because he's simply too big to fit into any one department. There's no place to put him. And so we have the irony of a 300-pound writer who has fallen through the cracks. The problem, of course, is not with Chesterton, but with our compartmentalized way of thinking and our departmentalized way of teaching. In the modern world, everything is separated from everything else. And that is because everything is detached from a central truth, which is religious truth. It is in his defense of this central truth that Chesterton reveals himself to be a complete thinker. And in doing so, he exposes all the fragmented philosophies that prowl the earth. He is a complete thinker for the simple reason that he knows how to think. We do not know how to handle him for the simple reason that we do not know how to think. We have lost that simple skill. It is a simple skill, but it's still hard work. In fact, Chesterton says that thinking is the hardest work in the world. And hard work, he says, is repugnant to our nature. We're lazy. And we'd rather have someone else do our work for us, even our thinking. It's much easier to have someone else tell us what to think. One of the reasons that it's hard to think is that it's hard to talk. It's hard to put our thoughts into actual words. Even when we put language to work, we find that language is always falling short of what we want it to do. Chesterton says we're struggling in a fallen language like men struggling inside the folds of a fallen tent. And it seems as if language continues to fall. It's hard to imagine how much farther it can fall. We seem to be getting more and more inarticulate. We try to say more and more with fewer and fewer words. If you want a really horrifying vision of the future, just take a look at the way our young people talk.
So, he was like looking at me. And I was like, what are you looking at me for? And he was like, I'm not looking at you. And I was like, well, it looks like you're like looking at me. And he was like, why would I look at you? And I was like, whatever.
They have taken this form of minimalist language to its minimum. Their vocabulary consists mostly of like, Perhaps the only word of multiple syllables that you'll ever hear them say is whatever.
Whatever.
Whatever. Now, that is the ultimate postmodern word. It reveals the thinking of the postmodern world, which is, I'm not going to think about this. But what do those other words mean?
Like.
Like. Like means a lack of precision. It means only an approximation, a vague similarity. They cannot say what is, only what is like. They cannot even say. Like has replaced say. What does mean? Is the most articulate of their inarticulate sounds because it sums up everything else that is missing from their mind. It's just a sound that is utterly meaningless, and yet it takes up the greater part of their speech.
You know.
What does mean? Means I don't know. It means I hope you know because I don't. I don't know what I'm saying because I haven't figured out how to say it or even what to say.
Whatever.
But why can't they talk? Because they cannot think. There are no words because there are no thoughts to correspond with them. And why can't they think? Because we have not taught them how to think. And what could be more frustrating for them? They get angry because they cannot express their anger, because they cannot express anything. And finally, the rage is released in the most brutal and unimaginable ways, in loud, pounding music that fills their empty heads with sound instead of words, in loveless sex that fills their empty souls with something like affection, or ultimately and tragically in something even worse, in death, violent death, in the murder of their unborn children or of their fellow students or of themselves. Yes, thinking is important. Chesterton says, if you think wrong, you go wrong. And that's why we need to be taught how to think.
If people must not be taught religion, they might be taught reason, philosophy. If the state must not teach them to pray, it might teach them to think. And when I say that children should be taught to think, I do not mean, like many moderns, that they should be taught to doubt. For the two processes are not only not the same, but are in many ways opposite. To doubt is only to destroy. To think is to create.
Thinking could be taught in our schools today. It was taught in medieval schools, and it could be taught quite easily. Most thinking, says Chesterton, consists of a few quite elementary maxims. 1. All proof begins with something which cannot be proved, but can only be perceived or accepted, and is called an axiom or a first principle. 2. There can be no argument except between those who accept the same first principle. And 3, an act can only be judged by defining its object. This basic equipment, these simple tests, would save us a lot of trouble and a lot of work. Now, let's take them one at a time. First, all proof begins with something which cannot be proved, but can only be perceived or accepted, and is called an axiom or a first principle. The point here is that faith precedes all argument. This is a point, says Chesterton, already laid down in Euclid. Euclid cannot prove one proposition without getting us to agree to his assumptions. Even Father Brown, Chesterton's great detective, affirms this.
Only a man who knows nothing of reason talks of reasoning without strong, undisputed first principles.
Here is a basic, undisputed first principle. Chesterton realized it when he was a young man. He was struggling with depression, and he was really quite deep in a personal darkness, but he grasped one rudimentary first principle that helped pull him out of it. And this was long before he embraced Christianity. And it was this: existence is better than non-existence. If we start with that idea, we can do a lot of good thinking. We can avoid a lot of bad thinking. The second maxim: there can be no argument unless it is between those who accept the same first principle. Chesterton could debate with anyone because he could always find something that he agreed with in his opponent's argument. And then by building on that idea, he could proceed to demonstrate the incompleteness of his opponent's argument. And when I say that he could debate with anyone, I mean there was, in fact, one person that he refused to debate. It was a Satanist, a man with whom he could find nothing in common, no first principles in common. I've called Chesterton the apostle of common sense because of his great ability to appeal to truths that we all recognize to be true. That is, truths that we have in common. There are exceptions, of course. There are people who reject all the common truths. But if we can't agree on first principles such as existence is better than non-existence, then we cannot really hold a conversation, not even about the weather. The third maxim: an act can only be judged by defining its object. One of the reasons we do not know how to think is because we cannot define the object of our actions. Chesterton says the whole modern civilization does not know what it is trying to find, and therefore does not find it. The only object of existence is to mean something.
All through history, there have been broad conceptions of the aims of life, tests of morality which masses of men have held and applied with certainty. But in the modern world, these various systems have been abandoned, and what is left of them is nothing but debris, a collection of broken bits, the ruins of past philosophies. There are some, like myself, who hold a mystical philosophy, a belief that behind human experience there are realities, powers of good and evil, and that the final test for things is their influence for good or evil. The good power intends us to be happy, and we are justified in being happy. But the real question is not whether we are happy, but whether, behind the things wherein we seek our happiness, lies the power of good. Are they parts of the good or of the evil?
Everyone wants happiness, but can we be happy with evil? Is there a higher test than just happiness? Where are we going? And how can we choose to go there? And must we go there? Most modern ideas, narrow as they are very deterministic. They rob us of our free will. Our actions and their consequences are explained away by biology or psychology or sociology or economics or sex or something. Chesterton points out that if we take any of these modern philosophies to their logical conclusions, they lead to madness and then self-destruction. A strict determinist cannot even say, please pass the salt. The attack on free will, on personal responsibility, has also diminished our ability to think for ourselves. It's even left us despairing of thinking that we should think for ourselves. Only with free will are we able to enjoy the freedom to pursue joy. And that's why existence is better than non-existence. And so, these three maxims are essential. They form the basis by which we can test everything. What are its origins? What are its ends? What are the first principles? Can we agree on them enough to argue? What is our ultimate goal? If we follow those three maxims, we would know how to think. There's another way to learn how to think, to follow the example of a great thinker. And there are few things that will give you a better appreciation of everything than watching a great mind at work, which is why we have tried in these programs to give you a glimpse of the mind of G.K. Chesterton. If we were to sum up his thinking, which is rather a bold thing to try to do, we would do it something like this. We would begin at the beginning, creation. Everything could not have come from nothing. When we acknowledge God as the creator, it puts everything else properly into perspective. Chesterton realizes that existence itself is a gift, something that we did not deserve. The only logical response to a gift is gratitude. Chesterton says thanks are the highest form of thought. If we let thankfulness fill our day, it'll eliminate most of the anger and frustration and distraction that contributes to the world's overall confusion. The next point is that God made us in His own image. We too are creators. This is the basis of all art. Just as we are mirrors of God, so should what we create further reflect God's glory. Creation is a giant, brilliant, multifaceted diamond. But it's broken. There's a major disconnect between God and us. Chesterton is an original thinker because he emphasizes original sin. He says it's the only Christian doctrine that we can prove. Just look around. There is a created order, and in keeping that order we are happy and we are free. In upsetting that order, we inflict a disorder which makes us miserable, and the whole world is very miserable. But there's a way out of this misery, a solution so creative that it could have only come from the Creator Himself. It's what Chesterton calls the strangest story in the world, the story of God sacrificing Himself to Himself, of turning His back on Himself, of dying a horrible death because of the horrible sin in the world, but defeating death by rising from the dead. The story of Jesus Christ is either the fundamental truth of existence, or else it's the most fabulous lie in history. But if it is true, it affects everything else.
Things can be irrelevant to the proposition that Christianity is false, but nothing can be irrelevant to the proposition that Christianity is true.
When Christ came, he did not found a new religion. He did not start an ethical society. He established something else, something completely different, a church. That church built our civilization. It brought us the sacraments, it took care of the poor and chastised the rich, and celebrated the marriages and blessed the babies and buried the dead. And the world has turned around and robbed it and ridiculed it and reduced its role in society. But the gates of hell have not prevailed against it. The Catholic Church, says Chesterton, is not merely right, but right where everything else is wrong. And that is why this amazingly profound and clear thinker, G.K. Chesterton, chose to join that church. He said, "Becoming Catholic does not mean leaving off thinking. It means learning how to think." Think about it. Think. I'm Dale Ahlquist. Please join us again on The Apostle of Common Sense.